So I'm going to attempt to show a demo here of how I would ink and print my linoleum block. Now I haven't actually finished carving my block yet, so I still have the Mod Podge on here, so I'm not too sure I'll get a great proof, but I'm going to give it a shot and see how it goes so that I can show you the setup and show you how we would use the jig. So some of the materials that I have ready to go are a surface for inking. Now I do not have a piece of plexi with me. Most of you should have that from your kit. I don't have a piece at home, so I'm using this cheap cookie sheet that I actually use for various arts and crafts purposes, so it's not something I actually cook on. You could even use a glossy catalog cover, anything that's smooth and slick that won't absorb the ink. I have my brayer. I have a spoon for applying pressure, so you can experiment with different objects. I have a wood spoon, I have a metal spoon. Some people use a rounded bowl, like a mason jar if it's smooth on the bottom. I have my ink. Now I don't have the same ink that you have in your kit, the black ink. I have the speedball ink, so that's what I'm going to be using today, and I don't actually have any black, so I'm going to be using this turquoise color that I happen to have. So I'm going to, and I don't have a palette knife like we have in the classroom, but most of you should have one in your kit. So I just made one out of a scrap piece of tag board. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start by applying a line of ink on my surface. And when I start using the brayer, I want to go down, and I want to be picking up the brayer as I go down. If I just go back and forth without picking it up, it's just going to keep putting the ink right in the same spot. But if I pick it up and move along, and once I get a little bit of ink down, I can leave extra ink along the top. And I like to go in two directions. You don't want to spread your ink out too much, because then it'll just dry out. Now if you're using the speedball inks, like I mentioned in our phone call, you can experiment with adding a tiny bit of hand cream that has glycerin in it to slow down the drying time. So I'm going to go ahead and mix in a little bit with this ink that's up here, since I forgot to do it at the beginning. All right, so now there's a little bit mixed into the leftover ink. That should slow down the drying time a little bit. Those of you using the etching inks, that shouldn't be an issue. You shouldn't have to worry about that. All right, so once I have the ink on the roller, you'll notice that you start to get a nice even consistency with your ink. And you want that. It'll kind of make this nice sound. It'll start sounding nice and velvety. If it's really watery or gushy, or the brayer's slipping around, that means there's too much ink. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to start with moderate pressure, rolling. I want to make sure I go all the way from the bottom to the top, top to the bottom. And especially the first time you print, you're going to need to go back for more ink a couple times, because the block will be a little bit more thirsty. Once you have done a couple prints, there's some residual ink on the block. You don't need to worry about it. You know, you don't need as many coats. So I'm going in two directions and just looking for that nice even layer. And you notice I put down a little bit of newspaper there to protect my work surface. Okay, so I have a nice even layer of ink. I'm going to keep my brayer face up. Move that out of the way. And I'm going to get the jig that we made. I'm going to put the block in the hole here, kind of make sure it's pushed up against there. And then I'm going to take my piece of paper and carefully place that in the corner here, right up against, and of course, excuse me. Okay, and then once I give it a little pat, once I know it's in the right place, if I give it a little pat on the linoleum, that'll help it not slip around. Then I can take my spoon and I can just do circular motion all along the surface of the block. Making sure that you get every section of the block. If you have a thin paper, you can actually get a sense of how much of it is transferred over just kind of by seeing through the paper. Now you might want to use a piece of clean scrap paper as like a buffer in between the surface, especially if you have extra ink. If it feels like your surface is a little bit dirty, you can do that. So that's kind of preference. You can kind of experiment with that. Mine's a little bit bumpy because of that Mod Podge. And then you can always peel back and take a peek if you want to get a little bit of a sense of how much is transferred. So I can see here that it looks like it's transferring pretty well. Maybe a little bit of extra love around the edges. And at this point, this paper's stuck on the paper is stuck to the linoleum block, so I can even move the jig out of the way. Okay. Again, if you were using the wooden spoon, it would be a similar technique, but just with the wooden spoon. Okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and lift this up. And there's my print. A little bit bumpy in the background because of that Mod Podge, but I get a really nice clear proof of how my hedgehog is coming along. Now when it's time to clean my linoleum block, ideally I don't want to just stick this in water because it will start to curl. So one thing I might do is take a piece of scrap paper and just use that to get some of the ink off. That might be residual ink. So I can kind of, and actually can get a pretty nice little ghost print too. That could be a nice start for a monoprint or a drawing. So I'm just using my hands here to get some of that extra ink off. All right, and then once I get some of the extra ink off, I can go ahead and I can use, I'm using just a wipey, but if you don't have wipies, you could use or just a damp rag or a damp paper towel. If you use a damp rag, if you have a rag, you could always just use that, and as long as you rinse it out right away before the paint dries on there, you could keep using that. Make that your linoleum wiping rag. And you can notice I'm getting the table surface a little dirty, so you might want to do this depending if you're working at a dining room table or something. Put a work surface down, some paper down first. And if there's a little bit of ink that gets caught in the recessed areas, that's really not that big of a deal, since that's the carved away area anyways, that presumably is not going to print, but I'll just go in there and try to get a little bit of it out. And you can see it cleans up pretty easily once I got the residual ink off. And there we go.